In the last video, I talked about the final years of the 7 Years' War and the massive changes it brought to the continent, from the capture of key French territories like Quebec and Montreal to the signing of the historic Treaty of Paris in 1763. This war not only reshaped borders, but also sowed the seeds for future conflicts. Alright, let's get started. In 1763, life's good in the colonies. If you were hanging around the British colonies in 1763, you'd probably be thinking life was pretty sweet. In fact, most people would tell you that the quality of life there was better than anywhere else in the world. And guess what? A lot of that was thanks to the 7 Years' War. Yep, war can be pretty sweet sometimes. You see, the British won the war, and with that victory, they wiped out any real foreign threats to their colonies. The French had been a problem before, but now, well, they were packing up and heading out of town. Their soldiers were abandoning forts, grabbing their baguettes, probably, and leaving town. Sure, there were still some French civilians hanging around, but now they were under British rule, and let's be honest, they probably weren't too thrilled about it, but that's a whole other story. So now no more French soldiers threatening the frontier. As for Spain, well, the British had taken Florida, so there wasn't much the Spanish could do. They still had Louisiana, but let's just say Spain was past its prime. Their power was on the decline, and even though they technically held Louisiana, it was mostly just a few officials and soldiers holding down the fort. Oh, and the French people living there, they weren't exactly throwing a welcome to Spain party either. Shout out to Assassin's Creed fans. Yes, this could totally be a plot line in one of those games. Anyway, with the French and Spanish out of the picture, there wasn't much to worry about from foreign invaders, and for the colonists, that was a huge relief. What about the Native American threat? Well, by 1763, most Native Americans had been pushed west of the Appalachian Mountains, so the majority of British colonists, especially those along the coast, hadn't seen any kind of attack in, well, generations. Grandpa might have a story or two about a raid from way back in the day, but for most people, the idea of a Native American attack was as outdated as dial-up internet. Even in the areas where Native American tribes remained, like down in the Mississippi region, most had figured out that fighting the British wasn't the best idea. They'd seen what British guns could do, and they weren't interested in poking that bear again. So, they were more into trading than raiding. Sure, there were still some tribes further west, like the ones up near the Great Lakes, who had been trading with the French. They weren't too happy about the British showing up and cutting off their supply of firearms and gunpowder, but honestly, the only people who had to worry about that were the hardcore frontier settlers, who for some reason thought moving beyond the Appalachians was a good idea. Spoiler alert, unless you are the type who enjoys the thrill of Indians trying to take your scalp, it wasn't always the best idea. Meanwhile, back in Europe, across the pond, things were a lot messier. If you were in France, you had to worry about Spain or Austria breathing down your neck. In Africa, you'd be dodging slavers. In Asia, oh, they had their own set of wars going on. But in British North America, no foreign invaders, no major threats from Native Americans. It was like living in the VIP section of the 18th century world for high society. Plus, the class divide was much smaller. Unlike Britain, where you were either dirt poor or living it up in a mansion, the colonies had a middle ground. You had landowners, farmers, and tradesmen who could make a decent living. All things that make you feel like you're living out the American dream. It wasn't all about being born into wealth or poverty. There was a little more wiggle room to improve your situation in life, which was pretty rare for the time. Climbing the colonial ladder, back in Britain, it was pretty much a roll of the dice when it came to your place in society. Either you were poor and stuck trying to get land, which was nearly impossible, or you were part of the 5% of the population that was born into wealth because, someone in the family did a favor for a king way back when. If you were born rich, odds were you'd die rich. Simple as that. Sure, there was a small middle class of merchants starting to rise, but let's be real, Britain was still very much a class-based society. The colonies, though, totally different ball game. Now don't get me wrong, there was still an upper class in the colonies. Some folks had more land and money than others, but the gap between rich and poor wasn't nearly as ridiculous as it was across the pond. In fact, about 10% of the colonists owned around 50% of the wealth. Okay, that might sound a bit lopsided, but hey, compare that to today, where it feels like the top 10% own 95% of everything, including the banks and maybe even Wall Street. Haha, just kidding. Maybe not kidding. The colonial wealth gap almost seems quaint by comparison. A fair shot at climbing the ladder. Here's where it gets interesting. Unlike Europe, where if you were born poor, you'd likely stay poor unless you had some kind of rags to riches Disney plot, the colonies offered a chance for social mobility. There were a few reasons for this. One, land. Thanks to the displacement of Native Americans and, a few diseases, land was more available than in the crowded old world back in Europe. Even though it wasn't as easy to come by as it had been in the 1600s, if you were willing to work hard, you could save up, buy some land, and start farming your way to a better life. It was kind of like winning the lottery, but with way more sweat and way less confetti. Second, smarts for the masses colonial society was also more educated than most other places in the world, which was pretty impressive for the time. In fact, more people in the colonies could read and write than just about anywhere else. Why? Well, blame or thank the Puritans. They were all about hard work and education, even if their strict religious fervor had mellowed out by 1763. The Puritans' work ethic remained in practice for generations to come. In New England, public schools had popped up, often at the local level. Towns would chip in to hire Bill the Brainiac to teach their kids, ensuring that the next generation knew how to read, write, and calculate just how much firewood they'd need to survive another brutal winter. And even down south, where literacy rates weren't quite as high, the pressure to keep up with the smartsy pants New Englanders led to the establishment of some public schools. Granted, if you were wealthy, you could just hire a private tutor and skip the whole public school thing. But the fact that there was even an emphasis on education for the common folk was a big deal. Slaves, unfortunately, were left out of this literacy movement, but even taking that into account, the colonies had higher literacy rates than most places in the world. So if you were born poor, you could get an education, grab some land, and start making your way up the social ladder. It wasn't easy, but the path was there, something you wouldn't find in a lot of other parts of the globe. And number 3, industrial opportunities beyond land and literacy. The colonies had the beginnings of a rudimentary industry. Now don't picture smokestacks and assembly lines just yet. We're not talking about a full-blown industrial revolution here, but there were definitely more opportunities than you'd find elsewhere. Whether it was shipbuilding, small-scale manufacturing, or trading, there were avenues for people to rise up economically. Compare that to Europe, Africa, or Asia, where many were stuck in rigid systems with little hope for upward mobility, and the colonies start to look pretty appealing. So here's how things were rolling by 1763. Britain had this nifty system going where they'd take raw goods from the colonies, like tobacco or leather, work their industrial magic, and turn them into finished products like cigars or shoes. It was like the 18th century version of getting a plain t-shirt and putting some badass looking print on it, and then it becomes something you could sell for 5 times the price. Britain was at the top of the manufacturing food chain and made sure their colonies stuck to the game plan and kept sending over raw materials rather than making their own finished goods. But, as in any good story of rebellion, the colonies didn't just sit there and take it. Particularly in New England, some early manufacturing began to creep in. Think shipbuilding, taking all that lovely lumber and turning it into sleek vessels, or sugar turning into rum because, let's face it, they probably needed a stiff drink after dealing with all those trade restrictions. And guess what? Manufacturing made way more money than simply farming raw goods, so it opened up a few new opportunities for those at the bottom to rise through the ranks. Even though the colonies weren't pumping out products on the scale of England or France, they still had a budding industry that offered wages and the potential for upward mobility. In Europe, Africa, or Asia, at the time, good luck finding anything like that. It's kind of like trying to land a tech job without ever hearing of Silicon Valley. It just wasn't in the cards, a different kind of persecution, unless you were enslaved. Now let's switch gears to another important aspect of colonial life. Persecution, or in this case, the relative lack of it, at least for the free population. Compared to much of the world, there was actually less persecution for religious and personal beliefs in the colonies. It was far from a utopia, but compared to the burn you at the stake vibe in other places, things were a little more chill. Of course, this little history lesson comes with a glaring asterisk: enslaved people in the southern colonies. By 1763, the brutal institution of slavery was deeply entrenched, and the laws were clear. Africans and their descendants were considered property, plain and simple. In fact, slavery in the British colonies, particularly in the South, could be harsher in certain ways than in other colonial regions, like the French Caribbean or Spanish-held territories. Let me explain. In the Catholic-influenced French and Spanish colonies, there was a slight chance that enslaved people could earn their freedom under certain conditions. You'd occasionally see slave owners free their slaves as a kind of reward for loyal service, often due to church pressure. In the British colonies, not so much. Freedom wasn't really on the table, and manumission, the act of freeing slaves, was looked down upon, so if you were born into slavery in the British colonies, chances were slim you'd ever know anything else. Running for freedom, the geography trap. Another bleak reality: it was much harder to escape slavery in the British colonies compared to, say, Brazil, where some enslaved people would run west into the Amazon and live out their days in freedom. The Appalachian Mountains and dense forests in North America made escape much riskier, fewer places to hide, fewer allies to help, and a higher chance of being caught. Plus, maroon communities, those settlements of escaped slaves, were far less common in North America. In places like the Caribbean and Latin America, there were occasional successful slave rebellions or large maroon communities. But that kind of resistance just didn't happen as often in the British colonies. So, if you were enslaved in the British colonies, chances of rebellion or escape were slim. But here's the grim silver lining: while freedom was rare, survival rates were a bit higher compared to enslaved people in the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean. There, the work was grueling, and tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever were rampant. Many slaves didn't survive to adulthood. In the British colonies, particularly in the tobacco and rice fields of the South, the climate wasn't quite as deadly, and enslaved people were often worked hard, but not to death. Why? Economics. It was expensive to import slaves from Africa, and owners wanted to protect their investment. So while the conditions were still harsh, and the idea of freedom was mostly a pipe dream, enslaved people in the British colonies generally lived longer than their counterparts in the sugar-producing regions. The economics of enslavement and the cost of labor. When it came to the economics of slavery in the British colonies, it was all about the bottom line. Transporting enslaved people from Africa to the Americas was a long, expensive journey. So once slaves were in the colonies, the last thing their owners wanted was to work them to death, because replacing them was costly. Unlike places like Brazil, where enslaved labor was often more expendable due to the closer proximity to Africa and therefore cheaper access, In North America, enslaved people were seen as a long-term investment. Not exactly a heartwarming thought, but in the twisted economics of the time, it meant that survival rates for enslaved people were generally higher in the British colonies. So, the grim reality, if you were born enslaved in British North America, your chances of gaining freedom were slim to none, but your chances of surviving into adulthood were slightly better than if you'd been enslaved in a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. Survival, yes, but freedom remained a distant dream. Women's rights, a mixed bag. Now let's pivot to women in the British colonies. In some respects, life for women was tough, just as restrictive, if not more so, than in other parts of the world. In England and the British colonies, women were generally viewed as inferior to men in most areas, particularly politics and business. Only men would talk about business and politics. Women couldn't vote or hold political office, and in many places it was outright illegal for women to own property or run businesses. For instance, if a woman's husband died, the property didn't automatically go to her. It went to the nearest male relative, like a son or brother-in-law. So, if you were a woman in the colonies, your ability to own land or participate in government was severely limited, to say the least. This was in contrast to Spanish colonies, where women had far more rights in terms of property ownership, thanks to the influence of Spanish law. The Reconquista and constant warfare had created a system where women often had to manage estates after their husbands died in battle. British women, they didn't get those rights handed down, which meant they were stuck in a much more patriarchal system. Education and opportunity, the silver lining. But here's where things get interesting. In certain aspects of colonial life, women in British North America had more opportunities than their counterparts in Europe or in other colonies. One of those areas was education. Thanks to the Puritans, particularly in New England, there was a strong emphasis on literacy for both boys and girls. The Puritan belief was that everyone, including women, should be able to read the Bible and communicate with God, so girls were often educated alongside boys, at least at the basic level. Of course, there was a point where the education paths diverged. Boys would go on to study subjects like politics, science, and business, while girls would be taught the arts, things like music, painting, and poetry. This may not sound like much, but in the grand scheme of things, this focus on the arts actually created some unique opportunities for women in the colonies. Many women, especially in New England, became skilled musicians, poets, or painters. This was one area where British society allowed women to shine. In fact, one of the most famous poets of the time, Phyllis Wheatley, was an enslaved black woman who gained prominence in New England for her work. Wheatley's poetry wasn't just a local success. Her writings were so impressive that she became known on both sides of the Atlantic. The fact that an enslaved woman was able to rise to such literary fame speaks volumes about the opportunities, however limited, that were available in the colonies. Teaching, an outlet for women, another area where women could find work outside the home, was teaching. In many colonial towns, the demand for education was so high that women could become teachers, especially in the elementary stages. Again, this wasn't something you saw in a lot of other parts of the world at the time. So, while the general expectation was that women should stay at home, raise children, and manage the household, a few avenues, like the arts and teaching, did offer women some degree of independence. The colonies in British North America were a dynamic blend of different people, faiths, and experiences. One of the defining features of life in the colonies compared to Europe or other parts of the world was a higher degree of religious freedom, though it was far from perfect. The Puritans, for instance, had come to New England seeking religious freedom, but they didn't always extend that same tolerance to others, particularly Catholics or even different Protestant sects. However, in places like Rhode Island, founded by Roger Williams, religious tolerance was an essential part of the government. The southern colonies, where economic interests dominated, were also relatively relaxed about religion, focusing more on making money than enforcing strict religious conformity. This religious diversity, and the colony's gradual movement toward more tolerance, was a huge social factor. By the mid-1700s, most colonies had relaxed their religious restrictions, allowing various Protestant sects to coexist. In Maryland, Catholics could practice their faith with more freedom than in most other British territories. Compared to Europe, where religious conflict could lead to war, exile, or worse, the colonies offered a level of religious flexibility that was unprecedented. This environment fostered a more open-minded and questioning populace, ready to challenge authority in other areas like governance and individual rights, the role of space and disease in social stability. Another factor that made colonial life unique, and in some ways more livable, was the relative lack of disease compared to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Much of Europe, with its dense populations packed into cities, was a breeding ground for infectious diseases. Plagues swept through cities, leaving devastation in their wake. The colonies, however, were largely agricultural, and people were spread out over vast areas of land. There were only a few large cities by the mid-1700s: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, with populations of over 5,000 people. This meant that epidemics, while still dangerous, were far less frequent and less devastating in the colonies. This more rural lifestyle contributed to social stability. With less disease and more available land, people could build lives that were more stable and self-sufficient. Open land, especially in the interior and along the frontier, meant that there was always the possibility of moving west, acquiring property, and becoming economically independent. This created a sense of opportunity, however limited, that wasn't available in the more crowded and hierarchical societies of Europe. This sense of potential was a key factor in the growing desire for independence and self-governance as colonists began to see themselves not just as subjects of the British Crown, but as individuals with a right to their own land and lives, women's opportunities, and shifts in social roles. Another social dynamic shaping the path toward revolution was the changing role of women, albeit slowly and with many limitations. Women, particularly in New England, had more access to education than their counterparts in many parts of Europe, especially because of the Puritan belief in literacy. This meant that women could read and write, giving them a certain degree of intellectual agency, even if they were still excluded from politics and property ownership. Figures like Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman and renowned poet, exemplify the paradox of colonial life, where even under the most restrictive circumstances, individuals could rise to prominence through education and talent. Additionally, the fact that women could sometimes petition for divorce, though rare and difficult, demonstrated a slight softening in the rigid social order of British society. While this didn't give women full autonomy, it hinted at the larger shifts happening in the colonies, shifts that would gradually contribute to the revolutionary atmosphere. As women engaged more with public life through teaching, writing, and the arts, they began to occupy a space that extended beyond the home, laying the groundwork for future social changes, economic growth, and the question of labor. The economic landscape of the colonies also played a huge role in driving revolutionary sentiment. As we've discussed, manufacturing, especially in the northern colonies, began to grow alongside traditional agriculture. Shipbuilding, textiles, and other industries started to take off, giving people, particularly the poor, a chance to improve their social standing. The availability of wage labor and the opportunity to own a small business or land gave many colonists a level of economic mobility that wasn't available in Europe's rigid class systems. However, this economic growth also created tensions with Britain, which wanted to maintain control over colonial trade and manufacturing. The British imposed restrictive trade laws to ensure that raw materials from the colonies flowed back to Britain, where they could be turned into finished goods. This mercantilist system benefited Britain, but frustrated many colonists, particularly those who were becoming wealthy through local manufacturing and trade. These economic grievances became a driving force behind the growing desire for independence as colonists chafed under the restrictions imposed by a distant government that seemed increasingly out of touch with their needs. Political leadership and economic growth. The colonial economy in the 18th century thrived under the guidance of influential political leaders who navigated the complex relationship between the colonies and Britain. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and other prominent colonial leaders encouraged local manufacturing and trade, seeing these as vital to the economic independence of the colonies. As the colonies developed their own industries, from shipbuilding in New England to agriculture in the South, many leaders advocated for policies that would allow greater economic self-sufficiency. However, this growth also sparked tensions with Britain, which sought to maintain tight control over colonial trade through a mercantilist system that benefited the mother country. British trade restrictions like the Navigation Acts ensured that raw materials flowed to Britain to be turned into finished goods, while colonial manufacturing was limited. Political leaders in the colonies began to push back against these restrictions, viewing them as an impediment to growth and prosperity. The frustrations of these rising colonial elites, those who had benefited from local manufacturing and trade, became one of the key forces behind the growing desire for independence, economic grievances, and the drive for independence. The restrictive trade policies imposed by Britain did not only hinder economic progress, they also ignited political debates. Leaders like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry vocally opposed British economic policies, portraying them as part of a broader pattern of overreach and a lack of representation. These grievances stirred a sense of unity among the colonies, as merchants, farmers, and even wealthier manufacturers began to see Britain as an obstacle to their economic and political aspirations. These rising colonial leaders, many of whom had become wealthy through commerce, emerged as the face of resistance. They framed their struggle for independence not just as a fight for political representation, but also as a defense of economic freedom and opportunity. The increasing frustration with British interference in colonial commerce laid the groundwork for what would become a revolution, one deeply rooted in the desire for local control of trade and industry. The perks of colonial life plus a few plagues. Life in the colonies had its ups and downs. On the plus side, you didn't have to worry too much about your neighbor's cough turning into a cholera outbreak unless you lived in the cities. Quarantines were a thing back then too, but if you were out in the countryside, you could go months without seeing your neighbors anyway. No one's passing you typhoid from 6 miles away, right? Now, if you were living in the southern colonies, you did have to deal with the occasional bouts of malaria or yellow fever. Those southern bugs weren't messing around, but thankfully up in the northern colonies, those illnesses were like tourists. They only showed up when it got really hot, so yes, disease was an issue, but compared to tropical regions or even Europe at the time, it wasn't that bad. Speaking of not that bad, let's talk about tea. It wasn't just the fashionable drink of the day. This British imported beverage had a hidden superpower. Since the colonists had to boil water to make their tea, they unknowingly killed off all sorts of bacteria in the process. And let's not forget alcohol, the other beloved drink of the era. It's not exactly your go-to for a health boost, but hey, it killed bacteria too. If you think about it, between tea and alcohol, the colonists were surviving partly thanks to their beverage choices. Cheers to that. Diet, more calories, less worry. Another secret to colonial longevity, A pretty decent diet, all things considered. Thanks to all that open land, there was plenty of room for crops. Colonists were growing wheat, apples, and other staples, plus being near the coast meant they had access to all the fish they could eat. Now don't get too excited. They weren't dining on gourmet meals, but compared to the average 18th century diet in Europe, the colonists were living large. More land also meant more economic opportunities. It wasn't all about farming either. There was trade, local manufacturing, and other avenues for wealth. As a result, people had more food on the table and, in general, were better off than many of their European counterparts. Plus, literacy rates were higher, so even if you weren't loaded with cash, you had a decent chance of getting an education. Don't bother me, Britain. The real cherry on top? By 1763, Britain mostly left the colonies alone. The British government was pretty hands-off, letting the colonies manage their own affairs. The king may have had his eye on the colonies, but he wasn't micromanaging them. The Virginia Company, for example, handled the day-to-day decisions, set up a judicial system, and even created the House of Burgesses, a representative body that made local laws. It was a system that worked well for most colonists. They could live their lives with minimal interference from across the pond. In fact, this level of independence felt pretty good, so good that, after the 7 Years' War, the colonists were quite content. Sure, they still appreciated their ties to Britain, but they also recognized that their setup was better than what most people had elsewhere. Colonial governments, local, loose, and pretty, chill in Massachusetts and really across all 13 colonies, the king granted each colony a charter that allowed them to set up their own local governments. These governments weren't distant or out of reach. They were local, meaning the people running the show were often just down the road. Towns set up their own courts to handle everything from property disputes to minor legal matters. So, if you had an argument with your neighbor about whose cow wandered onto whose land, you didn't have to wait for some royal decree from Britain. Local judges or officials handled it right there, which is nice. This system of local governance meant that the British government had little day-to-day interference in the lives of most colonists. Decisions about how to run the town, how to resolve disputes, or even how to defend against threats were largely handled by people you knew. This local control created a sense of independence and self-reliance that would later fuel revolutionary sentiments. Now, the king wasn't entirely hands-off. After granting these charters, he sent royal governors to keep an eye on things, but these governors quickly realized that meddling in day-to-day affairs was more trouble than it was worth. So they took a sit back and relax approach, occasionally chiming in, but mostly letting the colonial assemblies run the show. I like to imagine these governors sitting in their big colonial-era chairs, sipping tea, and complaining about Trump's mean tweets, while the local officials made the real decisions. Colonies, the DIY government experience. These colonial assemblies weren't just for show, they were the real deal. The assemblies were often made up of the people, well, the property-owning men, but still it was something. In places like Virginia, wealthy landowners could vote for representatives to serve in the House of Burgesses. Sure, it wasn't the most fair system, but compared to other parts of the world where you had absolute monarchs calling the shots, hello, Spain and France, it was a step up. Each colony had its own version of this setup, whether in North Carolina, South Carolina, or Georgia. So, if you had to be governed, at least it was by someone you knew and who might live just down the road. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than living under an absolute monarchy where you had zero say in what went on. At least in the colonies, you got to pick some of the folks in charge, even if it was mostly the landed elites. Salutary neglect. Britons, don't call us, we won't call you. Policy historians have a fun term for Britain's approach to its colonies. Salutary neglect. Sounds fancy, right? It's just a polite way of saying, as long as you pay your taxes and don't make too much noise, we'll leave you alone. The colonists loved this arrangement. Britain let them govern themselves, handle their own disputes, and make the important decisions, like whether or not to call up the militia if there was a conflict with a nearby native tribe. Royal governors were there to oversee things, but let's be honest, they mostly just sat in the back, letting the colonial assemblies take care of business. It was a win-win. The governors didn't have to micromanage, and the colonists enjoyed a decent level of self-governance. Taxes and representation, a colonial balancing act now. Taxes, everybody loves taxes, right? Well, the good news for colonists was that their local governments were the ones deciding how to tax. The colonial assemblies were the ones saying, okay, let's put a tax on this, but not on that. And while it wasn't exactly like today's system with income taxes being pulled straight out of your paycheck for roads, schools, and funding Ukraine, LOL, it was still a form of self-taxation. Colonists could at least take solace in knowing their taxes were going to fund their own local projects, not some far-off monarchy's whims. Taxes, duties, and how the colonies paid the bills. So let's break down taxes in colonial times compared to what we deal with today. You know how when you get your paycheck, the federal government takes a chunk for income taxes, then depending on where you live, the state might hit you with sales tax or property tax. For example, in Texas, every time you buy a candy bar, you're giving a little cut to the state, and property taxes are paid based on how much your house is worth. Well, back in colonial days, before 1763, it was kind of like that, but different in key ways. First off, the only folks collecting taxes in the colonies were the colonial assemblies, those local representative governments. If a colony like Virginia wanted to build schools, fix roads, or do something big, the colonial assembly decided how to raise the funds. They might come up with a property tax or something more creative like a sales tax on local products. Maybe they'd slap a small tax on honey, for example, to build a road or fund a school. But here's where things get interesting. The British government wasn't involved in taxing the colonists directly. All local tax collection was handled by the colonial assemblies, and because these assemblies were made up of people the colonists actually elected, folks generally accepted the taxes. After all, it was their own neighbors making the decisions, not some distant king. Now, the British government wasn't completely out of the picture. They did get money from the colonies, but only through something called duties. Duties are like taxes, but they're only charged on goods being imported into or exported out of the colonies. So, let's say a ship from Britain arrives in Charleston, South Carolina, carrying a bunch of fancy shirts. A duty collector, think of him as a colonial customs officer, would be waiting at the dock with a clipboard. He'd count the shirts and say, okay, these shirts are worth $10 each, and there's a 10% duty on them, so that'll be $1 per shirt. The money collected from these duties went straight back to Britain. It worked the other way too. If a tobacco farmer in Virginia was shipping out bales of tobacco to Britain, the duty collector would be there counting the bales and collecting a cut for the British government before the goods were shipped off. These duties were the only way Britain collected money from the colonies. No direct taxes like we have today. Now, here's where things start to get a bit tricky. Britain wanted to make sure the colonies were trading primarily with them and not with other countries like France, Spain, or the Dutch. So they put in place some pretty annoying restrictions to make sure that before any goods went to or from places like France, they had to pass through Britain first. This meant more duties, more middlemen, and more reasons for the colonists to start getting frustrated with British control. But more on that in a minute. Britain's trade restrictions and colonial workarounds. If you were in North Carolina and wanted to sell tobacco to France, you couldn't just ship it directly. Instead, you had to send it to Britain first, where a duty collector would take a cut. After that, your goods would be shipped off to France, but not before another duty collector potentially got his hands on your profits. By the time your goods reached France, you might have been hit with duties 3 times. So, a big chunk of your earnings was gone before your tobacco even reached French buyers. This wasn't an accident. The British did this on purpose to discourage colonies from trading with anyone but the mother country. Britain essentially added an extra step to keep colonies like North Carolina tied to British trade. It increased the cost and distance of trading with other countries. For instance, let's say you wanted to buy sugar from the French Caribbean islands. The French could produce it cheaper than the British islands could, but you couldn't just bring it directly to North Carolina. The ship would have to stop in Britain first, adding thousands of miles to the journey and racking up even more duties. By the time the sugar made it back to the colonies, it was much more expensive than if it had come straight from the Caribbean. Another British restriction was that manufactured goods leaving the colonies were taxed higher than raw materials. So if you were exporting tobacco, maybe you'd pay a 10% duty. But if someone took that tobacco and turned it into cigars, the duty might jump to 20%. Why? The British wanted the colonies to stay raw material producers, sending things like tobacco or lumber back to Britain, where they could turn it into finished goods and sell it back to the colonies for a hefty profit. Keeping manufacturing in Britain also kept colonial industries from competing with British businesses, many of which had members of Parliament with stakes in manufacturing. So, while the British collected duties on goods moving in and out of colonial ports, they also made sure colonies couldn't trade freely with other countries. Still, this system didn't affect most colonists. The vast majority were subsistence farmers, growing what they needed to survive, making their own clothes, and rarely buying imported goods. Only the wealthy landowners who had surpluses of crops to sell, or those who could afford luxury items from Britain, really felt the squeeze from these duties. For those wealthy colonists, duties were a frustrating part of life, but they soon figured out ways to avoid them. One of the most common tricks, bribing the duty collectors. These customs officers were often poorly paid, and for the right price, they could be persuaded to turn a blind eye. With a few pounds slipped their way, they might ignore a shipment or underreport the value of goods, saving the colonists from paying those pesky duties. And just like that, smuggling became a common workaround in the colonies, helping people avoid British trade restrictions altogether. Now imagine this. You're a tobacco farmer in North Carolina, getting ready to ship 500 pounds of tobacco. But instead of paying duties on all 500 pounds, you strike a deal with the duty collector. You slip him some money under the table, and he, officially, only counts 200 pounds. This way, you're paying less in duties, pocketing more of your profit, and everyone walks away a little richer. This type of bribery was common, and the colonial duty collectors, often underpaid, were more than willing to play along. But if bribery didn't work, smuggling became the go-to option. Think of it like Han Solo in Star Wars, not smuggling illegal goods per se, but dodging trade restrictions and duties. Colonists who wanted to avoid the British taxes entirely would sail their ships into smaller, unmonitored harbors far from the major ports where duty collectors were stationed. It took a bit more effort, sure, offloading goods by hand, transporting them inland by wagon, but the savings made it worth the risk. And what was the risk? Well, if the British caught you smuggling, they could seize your ship, your goods, and throw you in jail. But before 1763, the British weren't exactly focused on hunting down smugglers. Most colonial officials turned a blind eye to minor infractions under a policy of salutary neglect. They knew smuggling and bribery happened, but didn't make a fuss about it because overall, things were running smoothly. In fact, by 1763, relations between Britain and its colonies were pretty rosy. King George III, the fearless leader of Britain through the 7 Years' War, was well regarded in the colonies. The colonists loved the fact that Britain wasn't meddling in their local governments or slapping them with harsh taxes. And after the British victory over the French, the colonists were so grateful that they put up statues of King George III across the colonies as a gesture of appreciation. But here's the irony. By 1763, everything seemed perfect. The colonists felt they had it better than anyone else in the world. Fast forward a little over a decade to 1776, and those same statues of King George would be pulled down. Why? What could have changed so drastically? Well, that's where the next chapter of this story comes in. Stay tuned. Things are about to get really interesting.
In the dawn's early light, our flags were sung with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the drum beats in our hearts, we chased away the dark. Men of